You need
Sign
to
it,
sign the
the voice
restructuring
said.
agreement now.
Sign it now, before
I'll
the
sign
board
it.
changes their mind.
He's going to ruin
I
everything.
trusted that voice more than I trusted my own hands, and it was about to cost me everything I'd spent 19 years building. My name is Marcus Vale. 6 years ago, a car accident took my sight, and it took something else, too. It forced me to relearn who deserved my trust, because I could no longer read a face, only a voice. If stories like this touch your heart, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and comment below before we begin, because this story will stay with you until the very end. I built Vale Systems from a garage with 2 employees into a company worth $400 million. I was 34 when the accident happened. A drunk driver, a highway overpass, a windshield that saved my life and took my eyes in the same violent second. I woke up in a hospital room, and the first thing I remember is a nurse's voice, calm and low, telling me it was going to be all right. I believed her immediately and completely, before I even knew her name. That's when I first understood something that would define the rest of my life. A voice tells you more truth than a face ever could, if you learn how to listen for it. For 6 years, I ran my company blind, literally. I learned to read people by the shape of their sentences, the half-second hesitation before a lie, the small catch in someone's throat when they were hiding something. My executive team learned to work around it, mostly. Some resented it, some used it. I found out eventually that a blind man is either the hardest person in the world to fool or the easiest, depending entirely on who's standing in front of him. There was only one voice in that entire building I trusted without question. It belonged to a man named Desmond Reyes, the overnight security supervisor. 41 years old, divorced, raising his 8-year-old daughter Nadia on his own after his ex-wife left for a job overseas and simply never came back for her. Desmond worked the graveyard shift because the pay was slightly better and because it let him pick Nadia up from school every afternoon without paying for daycare he couldn't afford. He'd been at Vale Systems for 4 years, ever since the accident, and somewhere in that time, without either of us quite noticing it happening, he became the only person in the building I never once had to guess about. It started small. I used to stay late in those first years, avoiding the empty apartment I couldn't navigate as easily as the office I knew by muscle memory. And Desmond would do his rounds and stop by my office to check if I needed anything. Water, the thermostat adjusted, a door propped open. Simple things. But he talked to me like a person, not a liability. He never lowered his voice into that careful, over-enunciated tone people use with the blind, like volume compensates for sight. He argued with me once, actually argued, about a badge policy I'd approved that he thought was unsafe for night staff. And I remember being so startled that someone in that building had the nerve to disagree with me that I actually laughed out loud in the middle of his complaint. "You're the first person who's corrected me since the accident," I told him. "Somebody's gotta," he said. "May as well be the guy who checks your door locks." Over 4 years, that grew into something I can only describe as the one relationship in my professional life untouched by ambition. Desmond didn't want my money. He didn't want a promotion out of security. He wanted to go home to his daughter at the end of his shift, and everything else was secondary. There's a particular kind of honesty that only exists in people who've stopped performing for advancement. And Desmond had that honesty in every word he ever said to me. I learned things about him slowly, the way you learn things about someone when you're not actively trying to extract information, just accumulating it naturally over years of small conversations. I learned his ex-wife, Carla, had taken a job overseas when Nadia was 4, promising it was temporary, promising she'd send for both of them once she was settled. That promise had quietly expired somewhere around Nadia's 6th birthday. though nobody had ever formally said the words out loud. I learned Desmond had wanted to be an electrician once, had actually completed 2 years of an apprenticeship before Nadia was born. Before single fatherhood rearranged every plan he'd ever made for himself into something smaller and more urgent. I learned he read to her every night before bed, even on nights he came home at 6 in the morning after a full overnight shift, because he'd promised her, when she was 5, that he'd never miss it. And he apparently considered a broken promise to an 8-year-old a far more serious offense than exhaustion. I never asked for any of this information. It arrived the way honest things usually do, offered freely, without calculation, in the gaps between more practical conversations about door locks and badge policies. I began to notice, without quite naming it at first, that I looked forward to those gaps more than almost anything else in my day. There was a night, maybe 2 years into knowing him, when Nadia had a fever and the sitter he'd arranged had canceled last minute, and Desmond called to say he needed to leave his shift 3 hours early, apologizing so thoroughly that I finally had to interrupt him. "Desmond," I said, "you don't need my permission to take care of your daughter. You need my blessing to stop apologizing for it." He went quiet on the phone for a moment. "Not everybody sees it that way," he said finally. "Most places, a single dad taking time off for a sick kid gets quietly moved down the list come review season. I've watched it happen to other guys." "Not here," I told him, and I meant it, though I wonder now whether I fully understood at the time how rare that assurance actually was to him. How much weight a boss simply not punishing him for being a father had carried through years of other jobs that treated his daughter as an inconvenience he owed them an apology for. That was the kind of trust we'd built, brick by unremarkable brick, long before either of us knew it would matter as much as it eventually did. Which is exactly why what happened next nearly destroyed both of us. 3 weeks ago, my chief operating officer, a sharp, ambitious woman named Priya Ashford, brought me an acquisition deal. A logistics firm, mid-sized, struggling, ripe for a hostile buyout that would fold their client list into ours and effectively double our market share in the Western Corridor. She walked me through the numbers in that clipped, confident voice she always used, and everything sounded right. Everything sounded like exactly the kind of deal I'd built a career on saying yes to. "The board wants your signature by Friday," she said. "There's a small window before their lead investor pulls out. If we move fast, we get the company for 60% of its actual value." I trusted numbers. I trusted patterns. And Priya had never once given me a reason not to trust her voice, not in 3 years of working directly under me. But something felt wrong in the days leading up to that Friday. A low hum of unease I couldn't quite name. The kind of feeling a sighted person might dismiss as a shadow at the edge of their vision. I asked my assistant, Colton, to read me the financial disclosures aloud, twice. And both times, something about the debt structure of the target company felt off, buried in language dense enough to discourage anyone from actually parsing it. I asked Priya about it directly. "It's standard boilerplate," she said, without a beat of hesitation. "Every acquisition contract reads like a legal minefield. That's what the lawyers are for." I wanted to believe her. She sounded so certain. But 4 years of listening to Desmond Reyes had trained my ear for something specific. The difference between certainty that comes from truth and certainty that comes from rehearsal. Priya's voice, that week, had the second kind. I just didn't have proof yet. And a blind man without proof is just a paranoid man in the eyes of a board of directors who can see the polished slide deck perfectly fine. That Thursday night, working late again, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my office that I didn't recognize. A rhythm slightly off from Desmond's usual patrol. A hair too fast, too purposeful. I called out, and it was Desmond after all, just moving quicker than usual. Because, he explained, he'd caught someone accessing the server room on the executive floor who shouldn't have had clearance that late. Who? I asked. I couldn't see clear enough on the camera angle to be sure, he said. But it wasn't IT. IT badges in through the east door. This person came from the west stairwell, the one that connects to the executive offices. Priya's office was on that floor. So was mine. So were 3 others. Pull the footage, I said. All of it. Every angle. He did. What he found, over the next 36 hours of quietly, carefully checking timestamps against badge logs on his own time, off the clock, because he said he didn't like loose ends near my office, was that someone had been accessing my private files for weeks. Correspondence, draft contracts, voice memos I dictated to myself when I was thinking through decisions, memos I'd never shared with anyone, memos where I spoke my honest doubts out loud in the privacy of what I believed was a locked digital folder. Someone had been listening to how I thought. Someone had been studying not just my decisions, but my hesitations, the exact places where my doubt lived, so they could learn to talk me past them. That Thursday night stretched into one of the longest nights of my life since the accident itself. Desmond didn't just hand me a conclusion and leave. He sat with me in that office until nearly 3 a.m, walking me through everything, file by file, timestamp by timestamp, reading each access log aloud, because I couldn't read the screen myself and refused to wait until morning to have someone else read it to me. I remember the particular exhaustion in his voice by 2 a.m., the kind that comes from a man who still had to be up in 4 hours to get his daughter ready for school. And I remember offering to let him go home and finish in the morning. And I remember him refusing. You've got a signature to give away $400 million worth of trust in about 6 hours, he said. I can sleep after Nadia's on the bus. Somewhere around 2:30, we found the pattern that changed everything. A folder of audio files, hidden 3 subdirectories deep, named with innocuous project codes that meant nothing on the surface. Desmond played the first one, hesitant, unsure what we were about to hear. And it was Priya's voice, alone, late at night based on the file's own metadata, running through phrases like an actor rehearsing lines for an audition nobody else knew was happening. Marcus, Desmond said, and I noticed he used my first name, which he almost never did during work hours. That alone told me how serious this was. I think somebody's been building a picture of exactly what convinces you, and I think they're about to use it. Friday morning arrived, and with it, the signing meeting. Priya's voice on the phone that morning was warm, encouraging, almost soothing. The voice of someone walking a nervous client toward a decision already made. The board's ready whenever you are, she said. This is going to be the deal that defines the next decade for us, Marcus. I really believe that. I asked Colton to delay the meeting 2 hours, citing a headache, which was not entirely a lie. In those 2 hours, Desmond and I sat in my office with the door closed while he played me, on a small speaker, 3 recovered voice memos he'd found buried in the accessed files. Memos of Priya rehearsing, alone in her office late at night, weeks earlier. The exact phrases she would eventually say to me almost verbatim. Not just talking points, rehearsed cadences, the precise inflection of concern she'd use, practiced over and over, to make manufactured urgency sound like organic conviction. This is going to be the deal that defines the next decade for us, Marcus. Rehearsal, Priya said, in a flat, testing tone. Nothing like the warm delivery I'd later hear live. I really believe that. Over and over, adjusting the emphasis each time, like an actor workshopping a line until it landed exactly right. My stomach turned over completely. 6 years of trusting my ears above everything else, and someone had figured out how to weaponize the very thing that made me feel safe. "There's more," Desmond said quietly. And I heard something in his own voice now. Not triumph, not vindication, just a heavy, reluctant dread. "The logistics company you're about to buy. It's not struggling because of the market. Priya's brother-in-law sits on their board. They tanked their own numbers deliberately over the last 2 quarters to justify the discount price. If this deal closes today, in 6 months, that company gets quietly restructured back to full value under a shell entity, and the difference, the 60% discount you think you're getting, walks straight into accounts connected to her family. You'd be paying full price for a company you think you're getting for less, except the extra money disappears somewhere you'll never trace it, buried under the acquisition paperwork." I sat there in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that used to terrify me after the accident, before I learned that silence isn't empty. It's just a room full of things you haven't heard yet. "Why are you telling me this instead of just letting it happen?" I asked him. And I don't fully know why I asked, except that some part of me needed to hear him say it, needed one more piece of proof that his voice was exactly what I'd always believed it to be. "You could disappear into this building and no one would ever question you for staying quiet. It's not your fight." There was a pause before he answered, and in that pause I heard something I recognized instantly. Not hesitation, but the careful weighing of a man deciding whether honesty was worth the risk to everything he had. "4 years ago, you gave me a job when my ex-wife left, and I needed one that let me pick my daughter up from school," he said. "You never once made me feel small for asking for that schedule. Every other place I applied treated a single dad like a liability. You didn't. I'm not telling you this because I want something from it, Marcus. I'm telling you because you're the only boss I've ever had who actually listened when I talked. And I'm not about to watch someone burn that down because they figured out how to fake it." I called an emergency board session for that afternoon instead of the signing meeting. I brought the voice memos. I brought Desmond, not as a security guard standing quietly by the door the way people expected of him, but as a witness sitting directly at the table. And I watched, or rather, I listened to, the room shift the moment he began to speak. I heard the small, telling sounds of a room realizing it had underestimated the person in it. A chair creaking as someone leaned forward. A sharp intake of breath from the CFO. The particular silence of Priya Ashford saying absolutely nothing at all, for the first time in 3 years of never running out of words. The board pulled the deal within the hour. An internal investigation was launched the same week. It turned out the file access went even deeper than the acquisition scheme. 6 months of subtle financial redirections, small enough individually to avoid triggering alarms, large enough combined to have quietly siphoned nearly $2 million out of secondary accounts over the better part of a year. Priya resigned before she could be formally terminated, which her lawyer no doubt advised her was the least damaging option available, though the investigation into the fraud itself continued regardless of her employment status. I won't pretend the aftermath was simple or clean. There were weeks of lawyers, of forensic accountants going through years of records, of a board that suddenly wanted daily updates on a company they'd been comfortable letting run itself for years. There were nights I sat in my office, long after everyone had gone home, running through every decision I'd made over the past 3 years, wondering how many of them had been quietly shaped by a voice I'd trusted for the wrong reasons. Trusted simply because it was confident, not because it was honest. And I'd let myself confuse the two. The forensic team eventually traced the fraud back further than any of us had expected. Not just the logistics acquisition, but 2 prior deals from the year before, smaller ones that had seemed unremarkable at the time. both quietly benefiting the same small network of accounts connected to Priya's extended family. I sat through hours of depositions, listening to lawyers read numbers aloud that represented not just money, but a slow, patient betrayal that had been unfolding for far longer than the 3 weeks I'd initially believed. It was strange, and a little sickening, to realize that the voice I'd trusted for 3 years hadn't suddenly turned dishonest overnight. It had likely never been entirely honest at all. I simply hadn't yet learned to hear the difference. Some of my other executives, I discovered, had known fragments of what was happening and said nothing. Not necessarily complicit, but comfortable enough in their own positions that raising a concern about a rising star like Priya Ashford seemed like a career risk not worth taking. That realization hurt in its own particular way. A quieter, colder hurt than the betrayal itself. It's one thing to be deceived by someone actively working against you. It's another to learn that a dozen people who suspected something were simply willing to let it happen because speaking up wasn't in their own immediate interest. Desmond wasn't like that, and I don't think he ever could have been. Not because he was incapable of self-interest, but because he'd spent so many years learning that the people who protect you when it costs them nothing aren't the ones worth trusting. It's the people who protect you when it costs them everything. But there was also something else in those weeks. Something that mattered more to me than the recovered money or the resignation letter ever could. I promoted Desmond. Not out of guilt, and not as some hollow, symbolic gesture to make the story wrap up neatly. I created a position that hadn't existed before. Director of Internal Trust and Verification. A role built specifically around the instincts he'd already been using for years without a title attached to them. The instincts that had noticed a wrong rhythm of footsteps in a hallway and pulled a thread that unraveled a scheme worth millions. He hesitated when I offered it. I remember that hesitation clearly because it was so unlike him. "I don't have the degree for something like that," he said. "I never finished college. I was raising Nadia by 19. "I've had 4 executives with graduate degrees in this building," I told him. "Every one of them either missed what you caught or was complicit in causing it. I'm not hiring a diploma, Desmond. I'm hiring the only voice in this building I've never once had to second guess. That's worth more to me than any degree could be." He took the job. The salary alone changed his and Nadia's life in ways I don't think either of them had let themselves imagine were possible. No more choosing between the electric bill and new shoes for a growing 8-year-old. No more graveyard shifts that meant falling asleep during her school recitals from exhaustion. He moved them into a slightly bigger apartment, closer to her school, with a spare room that became, according to what he told me months later with an embarrassed kind of pride in his voice, the first bedroom that's ever really just been hers. There was a moment, a few weeks after the promotion, when Desmond came to my office at the end of the day, and I could hear something different in his walk before he even said a word. Slower, heavier, like a man carrying something he wasn't sure how to put down. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Why me? There were people in this building with security clearances higher than mine. People who'd actually gone to school for exactly this kind of thing. Why trust the guy who checks door locks?" I thought about that question longer than he probably expected me to. "Because for 4 years, you never once asked me for anything you hadn't earned," I said. "Everyone else in this building learned, eventually, how to sound trustworthy around me. You never had to learn it, Desmond, because you never once needed the performance. That's not something I can train an executive to do. Either a voice has that in it, or it doesn't." He didn't say anything for a while after that. When he finally spoke, his voice had a rough edge to it I hadn't heard from him before, not even that terrible Thursday night. Nadia asked me the other day why we suddenly have money for things we never used to have money for, he said. I didn't know how to explain it to an 8-year-old. I told her someone finally noticed. I don't think I ever really believed anyone would. I go into the office differently now. I still can't see the faces around the boardroom table, still have to build every person I trust out of nothing but sound and pattern and the accumulated weight of years, the same way I've had to since the accident. But I've stopped assuming that confidence and honesty are the same frequency. I've learned to listen for something quieter than certainty, the particular steadiness of someone who has nothing to gain from lying to you, someone whose voice doesn't change depending on who might be listening. Desmond still stops by my office some evenings, though less often now that his own schedule keeps him busier than it used to. A few weeks ago, he brought Nadia in after a school event, and I heard her voice for maybe the 4th or 5th time ever. Bright, curious, unguarded in the particular way children are before the world teaches them to perform. Is it true you can tell if someone's lying just by their voice? She asked me, with the blunt directness only an 8-year-old can get away with. Not always, I told her honestly. But I got very good at telling who's worth listening to in the first place. Your dad taught me that, actually, without either of us realizing it was happening. She laughed, delighted, the way kids laugh when adults say something they don't fully understand, but instinctively like anyway. Desmond didn't say anything, but I heard him shift slightly beside her, and I recognized the sound. The particular quiet of a man who has spent years being underestimated, standing in a room where, for once, he wasn't. I think about that Friday morning often, the 2 hours I bought myself with a small lie about a headache, the 2 hours that were the only thing standing between me and signing away millions of dollars to protect a fraud built specifically to exploit the 1 cent I had left to trust. I think about how close I came to losing everything because someone studied my blindness and mistook it for weakness, never once considering that 4 years of listening harder than most people ever have to had made me better, not worse, at recognizing the sound of the truth. I think, too, about all the ordinary days before that Friday. The sick nights Desmond apologized for needing off. The years of small conversations about nothing important that turned out, in the end, to be the most important information I ever gathered about anyone in that building. Trust, I've learned, is rarely built in the moment you need it most. It's built in the 100 forgettable moments before that, the ones that don't feel like they're building anything at all, until suddenly, on one impossible Friday morning, they're the only thing standing between you and ruin. And I think about Desmond Reyes, working graveyard shifts to be home for his daughter, never once asking me for anything, never once performing honesty because he simply didn't know how to be anything else. In a building full of people who learned exactly what to say to move me, there was only one voice that never needed to learn anything at all, because it was already telling the truth from the very first day I heard it. I built a $400 million company with my eyes wide open, but I nearly lost it the moment I stopped listening as carefully as I did the day I lost my sight. If there's one thing this taught me, it's that trust was never about who sounds the most certain in the room. It's about who's still telling you the truth when there's absolutely nothing in it for them. Nadia still asks me, sometimes, when Desmond brings her by after school, how I see things without seeing them. I never have a perfect answer for an 8-year-old. But I've come to think the truest version of it is simple. I stopped looking for people who sounded impressive and started listening for people who sounded the same whether or not anyone was watching. Her father has sounded exactly the same, every single day, for 4 years running. That, it turns out, was the only kind of proof I ever really needed. I found that voice in the last person anyone in that building ever thought to listen to. I hope, wherever you are, you're lucky enough to find yours too, and smart enough to actually hear it when you do.